Okay, so next we're going to go over nativism or cognitivism, and the main theorist here was Chomsky. And basically, the Gestalt psychologists were the first to challenge the behaviorists and criticize them for being too dependent on behavior that was overt or observable to explain learning. So instead, the cognitive theory that they suggest looked beyond behavior to explain brain-based learning. So what they did is they proposed to look at the patterns rather than just these isolated events in order to try and figure out how the patterns would explain learning taking place in the mind. Okay, so the major difference between cognitivists and behaviorists is the locus of control over the learning activity. So for cognitivists, it lies with the individual learner, right? The individual learner and their mind, the memory, and the brain-based learning going on. For behaviorists, it lies with the environment, right? A person doesn't learn without a stimuli from the environment that causes a response in the learner. Okay, so this is how they differed majorly. So again, as I said, they believed that the individual learner had control over their own learning, and the way that they accounted for learning to take place for individuals was through the memory system and the processing of information and knowledge that happened through the short-term and the long-term memory. They also believed that prior knowledge, or the knowledge that the child had learned previously, was very important to consider, given that it sort of provided the foundation on which all new information and new knowledge was being processed and linked to. So cognitivism was the larger theory in psychology, and from that Chomsky came along and used the same tenets to apply it to language acquisition and language learning. So what Chomsky said was that language was innate in human beings. And I'm going to play a little clip that describes this for you. And then I'll describe it for you myself as well.
إن شاء الله إنه ما نعمله من إعجاب الجميع يقدم ما نستطيع من أفضل
reden, wenn es sein muss, und die anderen skandinavischen Sprachen.
Almost inconceivable that our contemporary existence amongst any of its aspects could exist without language. Language has always been regarded correctly for many centuries as the distinctive feature of the human mind.
Nearly everything that defines us as human beings has language involved in it.
Language is a system that a system that we use to convey information.
Language is a biological tool. That is only available to the human species, and that enables the species to communicate.
Okay, so there you heard a little bit about how the people who come from the nativism perspective believe that language is an innate, inherent quality of human beings. So this is an ability that we're born with, which distinguishes us from other animals, so non-human animals. and that we are equipped with this ability, this language acquisition device, which picks up language, helps us make sense of it, comprehend it, and start to systematize it without necessarily the explicit support and help of others, right? Not in the way that the behaviorists felt that all learning needed a response and a stimuli. Okay, so there were some limitations, though, towards this theory. This theory did help explain how children came up with those linguistic forms that they would have never heard adults say, such as hitted and goad, right? Because if the theory states that if people have this innate ability at language, then it makes sense that they would be coming up with these new forms themselves because they are going through and systematizing the language that they hear. Okay, so that goad form makes sense because that ed is what we would generally add on to make past tense verbs, and that's why we see those forms, hitted and goad, right? So that really showcases how the person is making sense of language through that innate ability and that language acquisition device. It also accounted for the development of a grammar system by the child. Okay. Some of the limitations, though, was that this theory did not account for interaction or explain interaction at all. And there was this famous study in 1977 of a child whose name was Jim, and he was a hearing child who was born to deaf parents. And the deaf parents couldn't obviously model language for him or put him in an environment where he was hearing language with them. So what they would do is that they seated him in front of a TV and was using the TV as the source of language in his environment. When Jim got to school, he was found to be quite behind in terms of his language development, and he started working with a speech-language pathologist and somebody that would sort of help him, give him additional time to go through different language sort of activities. And what they saw was that Jim learned language at a much faster rate. He actually caught up to his peers. And what this shows was that what was needed was the interaction of a person. And so the interaction is a really important and formative piece of language development, right? It's not only that we're born with a language acquisition device, and it's not only that we need that response stimuli and that explicit language teaching from others, but that interaction is needed for the child to be able to learn and keep up on pace with peers who have had that interaction. The limitation also of nativism is that it did not account for motivation at all. Okay? Motivation was not a piece that was talked about in nativism. So that brings us to social interactionism, and this was the theory that was derived from sociocultural theory from Lev Vygotsky. And social interactionism is part of that theory, but the part that has been applied to describe language acquisition and development. So the tenets were that children construct knowledge when they participate in a social context with others where they're interacting and negotiating the meaning of the language that they're speaking. So it's not only just listening to language being used, but also having the opportunity to participate with others in a conversation that is spontaneous and to negotiate meaning themselves actively through interaction with others. Another piece of the theory was that learning can lead development. And so Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development, which showed that this green line here was basically what the learner can what the learner can achieve with assistance. Without assistance, the learner would be in the white area. Okay, but with assistance, there's this whole green span of activities and abilities that the child will be able to to do with help. And then after time, after the child has been learning through the assistance of a teacher, this leaves them in a place of what they will be able to achieve it independently, and you'll see this white space above that line. Once the teacher has modeled or the adult has supported that child and that student. So, zone of proximal development really talks about scaffolding. It talks about the support of someone who knows more than the child, and that support providing the learning that the child will develop in that interaction, and that learning leading to development, because after the teacher walks away, having provided the scaffolding, the child is more likely to be able to accomplish that task independently than they were before without the scaffolding. So that's what learning can need development means. And then lastly, sort of what seems to be obvious at this point is that development cannot be separated from the social context, right? So that interaction is highly important and sort of mandatory for language learning to take place. Because language exists for communication purposes and is learned through interaction, without that social context, really there's sort of a limit to how much a language can be learned. And that also explains why many people who go through high school and who learn a language in high school often cannot use it productively or use it in spontaneous conversation because they have not been placed in a social context often enough where they are negotiating their meaning and learning how to be more fluent in that language enough. Okay, so let's go over the first activity. What I'd like you to do is, you can find the document for this activity in the same unit where you're watching this video. And here I've listed the three language acquisition theories that we've gone over so far: behaviorism, nativism, and social interactionism. And if you open up that activity, you'll see that you'll have sort of the same grid and a list of different options that can be used to fill in this grid. In the first grid, I know that it's empty, but what is needed there is the main theorist who was sort of the lead of each theory. And then after that, you'll see prompts in your activity page discussing the different aspects of each theory. So I'll give you a moment to look that through and complete it, and then we'll go on. We'll do this together. Okay, so in the first, let's go over behaviorism first. In the first column, the main influential theorist for behaviorism was B.F. Skinner. When we talk about how language is determined in behaviorism, it is determined by imitation and reinforcement. So, for example, the child will be taught a behavior that is appropriate within the confines of what adults expect of them and how they react to the child's responses. So, for example, depending on a teacher's rules and ways in which they have previously responded to the child may or may not raise their hand when responding to questions. Okay. So in terms of the next part, behaviorism, in behaviorism, language is learned. Learners are passive in the learning process, and environment is key to language acquisition. Okay, learners are passive in the learning process because they are very much acting as a sort of reacting based on a stimulus. Okay, so if I give you one stimulus, you're going to respond in a particular way. If I give you another stimulus, you're going to respond in another sort of particular way. And because the active piece of this is the person who is providing the stimuli, that's sort of the person who's controlling the type of response that they're wanting to get. This is why learners are conceived as passive in the learning process. Also, language is learned because, again, it's a very controlled process from the person who's providing the stimuli to the response that they're waiting to get. And then last, environment is key to language acquisition, because without that observable change in behavior and without the response and stimuli that takes place in the environment, language acquisition according to behaviorism wouldn't occur. So let's go through nativism, the main theorist being Noam Chomsky. Here, language is biologically determined. Remember when we talked about that language is innate, and that it comes from, and that we're sort of born with a language acquisition device, that this inherent ability to learn language. This is what it's talking about. Here, language is acquired because, again, in cognitivism, the cognitivists are very much focused on what happens in the mind. Okay, and so they believe that language is acquired without necessarily the need for explicit reinforcement from the environment. Learners are active in the learning process because they are mentally going through the different language forms that they encounter and systematizing them. And they believe, but nativists believe, that the environment is only a trigger to language acquisition. Okay. In terms of social interactionism, Lev Vygotsky is the main theorist. Language is socially determined because language development takes place in the context of interaction in a particular sort of a classroom context per se, where different people are interacting with each other, engaging with each other, and participating in language use. Language is negotiated and acquired, and here learners are seen as active and interactive in the learning process. Through that conversation, where there's spontaneous talk happening, the learner is negotiating the meaning, both in terms of trying to understand what is being said to them, and also trying to make themselves be understood to others, right, using the language. And so it's very much an interactive process, and that's where the learning happens in terms of language. And in this sense, social interactionism is similar in this one particular way to behaviorism, in that the environment is seen as key. Again, it's sort of different in terms of the way that the environment is defined in each theory. But environment is still key in social interactionism, because this is where the interaction takes place, right? You need that other person, and therefore the environment is important.